Right, let's talk about something absolutely mental that just happened in British politics. Nigel Farage, the man who's had more political comebacks than a boomerang with separation anxiety, just watched his Reform UK party get absolutely battered in a by-election, whilst simultaneously consolidating his grip on the right wing of British politics tighter than a python in a sleeping bag. And here's the kicker. Both of these things might actually be part of the same story. I know, it sounds barmy, but stick with me because what's unfolding right now could reshape the entire landscape of British politics, and nobody's talking about the real story here. Quick favour, if you're loving this already, smash that subscribe button. Over 94% of you haven't yet. It's completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and it means the absolute world to us here at British Mirror. Cheers if you did. Right, back to the chaos. So here's what happened. Reform UK, Farage's latest political vehicle, just got absolutely shellacked in a recent by-election. We're talking proper thrashing, the kind of defeat that would make most politicians consider a career change to something less humiliating, like professional mime artist or traffic cone inspector. But whilst the headlines screamed about Reform's failure, something far more interesting was happening beneath the surface. Farage was quietly watching his competition on the right wing implode like a cheap Kent in a hurricane. The Reclaim Party, the SDP, UKIP, remember them? All these little right-wing parties that were supposed to challenge Farage's dominance, they're basically political footnotes now, barely registering in the polls, whilst Farage's Reform is pulling numbers that have the Conservative Party breaking out in cold sweats at 3 in the morning. Now you might be thinking, hang on a minute, didn't you just say Reform got demolished in the by-election? How is that consolidating power? Well, here's where it gets properly interesting. The by-election result didn't just show Reform losing, it exposed something that should terrify them far more than a bad night at the polls. It revealed what insiders are now calling the Stop Reform plot, a coordinated effort by the establishment parties to ensure that Farage's lot never ever get a sniff of real power. Think of it like political whack-a-mole, except the mole has a pint of bitter and strong opinions about the European Court of Human Rights. Let's break down what actually happened in this by-election, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. The seat in question was one where Reform should have, on paper, performed reasonably well. Working-class constituency, lots of Brexit voters, exactly the kind of place where Farage's message about immigration, sovereignty, and giving the establishment a good kicking usually resonates like a church bell in a library. But instead of making gains, Reform's vote actually went backwards. And when you dig into the numbers, you start seeing a pattern that's frankly disturbing if you care about democratic choice, regardless of what you think about Farage personally. Here's the thing. The tactical voting against Reform wasn't organic, it was surgical. Labour voters in Tory Reform marginal areas suddenly discovered a newfound love for the Conservatives. Lib Dem supporters who'd rather eat their own shoes than vote Tory were suddenly holding their noses and backing the blue team. Even the Greens, bless them, were quietly suggesting their supporters consider the bigger picture. And what's the bigger picture? Simple. Keep Reform out at all costs. It's like every other party looked at Reform and collectively decided, you know what, we disagree on literally everything else, but we can all agree that Farage cannot be allowed to win here. Now this is where it gets properly chess-like. Whilst Reform was losing this battle, Farage was winning a different war entirely. See, all those other right-wing parties I mentioned, they needed to believe they had a chance to pull voters away from Reform. They needed to think there was space for them in the British political ecosystem. This by-election killed that dream deader than disco. When Reclaim, the SDP and the remnants of UKIP saw Reform getting the full establishment treatment, the coordinated attacks, the tactical voting and the media pile-on, they realised something crucial. If Reform, with all its resources, media presence and Farage's name recognition can't break through, what chance do they have? It's like watching someone try to break down a brick wall with their head and then thinking, yeah, I'll have a go at that wall too. Not happening. So what did we see in the weeks following this by-election? A proper Darwinian moment in right-wing British politics. Smaller parties started folding like cheap deck chairs. Activists who'd been splitting their time between reform and other projects suddenly had a moment of clarity. Politicians who'd been flirting with starting their own movements looked at the stop reform machine in action and thought, perhaps not. And just like that, Farage found himself in the enviable position of being the only game in town on the right wing. Sure, Reform lost the by-election, but they won something potentially more valuable, a monopoly on right-wing populist politics in Britain. But let's talk about this stop reform phenomenon, because it's genuinely unprecedented in modern British politics. We're not talking about normal political competition here. This is something different. Think about it. When was the last time you saw the Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats essentially working from the same playbook to stop a single party? And I'm not talking about casual opposition. I mean coordinated tactical voting, messaging alignment, and what appears to be a gentleman's agreement not to split the anti-reform vote. It's like watching Britain's political establishment form Voltron, except instead of fighting alien invaders, they're fighting a bloke from Kent who really doesn't like the European Union. The mainstream parties will tell you this isn't a plot, it's just sensible voters making tactical decisions to keep extremists out, and fair enough, that's their right in a democracy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When the entire political establishment, from centre-left to centre-right, coordinate to prevent a party that's polling at 15 to 20% nationally from winning seats, you're not defending democracy, you're undermining it. You're essentially telling a significant chunk of the electorate that their votes don't count, that the system will arrange itself to nullify their political preferences. And if you think that's going to make those voters less angry, less alienated, or less likely to support someone like Farage, well, I've got a garden bridge in London to sell you. Here's where the irony gets so thick you could cut it with a knife. The stop reform strategy is actually making reform stronger in the long term. Every time voters see the establishment parties working together to block reform, it confirms Farage's entire narrative. He's been saying for years that the system is rigged, that the establishment is terrified of real change, that the major parties are all basically the same when it really matters. And now, the major parties are proving him right in the most spectacular fashion possible. It's like they've hired Farage as a consultant and asked him, what's the one thing we could do that would absolutely validate everything you've ever said about British politics? And then they went and bloody did it.
Meanwhile, back at Reform headquarters, Farage is watching his competitors on the right disappear like morning mist. The Reclaim Party, which was supposed to be the sophisticated, intellectual right-wing alternative, barely registering. The SDP, with their social conservatism and economic populism, invisible. UKIP, Farage's old stomping ground, they're less relevant than a floppy disk at an Apple store. And it's all because these smaller parties looked at what happened to Reform in that by-election and realized they didn't have the resources, the name recognition, or the sheer bloody-mindedness to withstand that level of coordinated opposition. Farage does. Say what you will about the man, and trust me, there's plenty to say, but he's got the political equivalent of Nokia brick phone durability. You can throw him at a wall repeatedly, and he just keeps working. This consolidation on the right is creating a fascinating dynamic heading into the next general election. The Conservative Party, already struggling to define itself post-Boris, post-Truss and post any coherent ideology, now faces a unified right-wing challenge rather than a fragmented one. Before, they could dismiss Reform and the other parties as fringe irritants splitting the right-wing vote. Now, Reform is the right-wing vote for a growing number of people. And whilst the stop reform tactics might work in individual by-elections where everyone can coordinate, in a general election with 660 constituencies voting simultaneously, that coordination becomes exponentially harder. But here's the really spicy bit that nobody's talking about. What happens when voters catch on to the stop reform game? What happens when working-class Labour voters in northern constituencies realise their party is essentially in an unspoken alliance with the Tories to keep reform out? What happens when traditional Conservative voters see their party accepting Labour tactical votes in some seats whilst competing against them in others? The cognitive dissonance alone could power a small city. And in that confusion, in that moment when voters realise the traditional tribal allegiances don't apply anymore, that's when Farage's argument about the political establishment being one big club that you're not in starts landing with devastating effectiveness. The establishment parties are basically playing a very dangerous game. They're betting that they can keep reform contained through tactical coordination whilst maintaining their own distinct identities and appeal. It's like trying to be enemies in public whilst secretly working together, except eventually someone's going to notice you're both targeting the same person and ask some awkward questions. And when those questions start getting asked loudly enough, the whole house of cards could collapse in spectacular fashion. Looking at the bigger picture, what we're witnessing is potentially a realignment of British politics that historians will write about for decades. Farage, through a combination of persistence, luck, and his opponent's mistakes, has managed to consolidate the populist right under one banner, just as the establishment reveals its hand in trying to stop him. It's the political equivalent of simultaneously winning and losing, except the loss might actually be setting up a bigger win down the road. The by-election defeat stung, sure, but it eliminated his competition and exposed the system that's arrayed against him. Not a bad trade-off if you're playing the long game. And make no mistake, Farage is always playing the long game. This is a man who spent 25 years banging on about leaving the European Union before it actually happened. He's got patience that would make a Buddhist monk look impulsive. So whilst everyone's laughing at Reform's by-election performance, Farage is quietly building the only serious right-wing populist movement in Britain, watching his rivals disappear and collecting evidence of establishment coordination that he can weaponize in every stump speech between now and the next general election. The stop reform plot, if we're calling it that, might win battles, but it's creating the conditions for reform to win the war. Every tactical vote against them, every coordinated message, every instance of Labour and Tory supporters holding their noses and backing each other just to keep Farage out, it all feeds into a narrative of establishment desperation that makes reform look more dangerous, more necessary, like the only real option for change.